Hello, everybody, and welcome to Learning About Learning. We are so happy to be here with everyone today. I am Ziva Hassenfeld, the Jack Joseph Morton Mandel Associate Professor of Jewish Education here at our Center for Studies in Jewish Education at Brandeis University. We are delighted for today's conversation with my close colleague and friend, Jon Levisohn. And before we sort of introduce the piece that we're going to be speaking about today, I just want to say how delighted we are that so many of you are joining us live and that I'm going to make a real effort as I speak with Jon to take your questions. So keep putting them into the Q&A. I will keep checking them and incorporating them into our conversation. We're also recording today's session, and we'll make that recording available afterwards on our website, our YouTube, and our podcast. So today we have the pleasure to talk to Professor Jon Levisohn about a new piece he wrote titled Teaching and Learning: The Norms of Judaism Beyond the Beit Midrash. We are just so excited to hear more about this project. And as we often do when we begin these conversations and learning about learning, I want you just to sort of tell us more about where did this project come from? How did you develop it? And how did you land where you landed?
Thanks, Ziva. It's great to be talking about this project with you. This is a continuation of conversations that you and I have had in various at various times in various hallways, and this is about something that we both care so much about, and that's been the centerpiece of so much of our work, namely the teaching of texts, but also thinking critically about the teaching of Jewish texts. This is a product of philosophical research and some historical research, not empirical research. And let me be a little bit more explicit what I mean by that. Sometimes we have kind of scholarly questions that we want the answers to, and the way that we try and get smarter about those questions is by going out and gathering new data from teachers or from students or in classrooms, whatever the case may be. And that's not how philosophers typically do their work. So instead, we typically read what other people have written and think about the arguments that they're making. And in this case, in the case of this article, it's really a book chapter. It came out in an edited volume. Um, the people whose work I was reading included a lot of historians who could help me to think about the ways that the Jewish relationship to text, the place of text within Jewish culture, has changed over time. And I can come back to that point later on in the conversation.
Great. So, sort of knowing you and knowing your work and knowing how you've evolved as a scholar, which you discuss quite explicitly in the chapter, that there was a moment where in your life where you assumed that teaching Jewish texts was central to Jewish education. And so I'm asking sort of that was helpful as far as the method of inquiry, but from a more sort of personal positionality perspective, what changed for you? Was there a particular scholarly encounter, teaching experience, or personal moment? I know that you do love text study that sort of provoked your thinking and your rethinking of that assumption.
Right. Right. And I mentioned that point in the chapter because I wanted to emphasize, and I want to emphasize now that I grew up deeply immersed in a culture that prioritized the study of text, classical Jewish texts in particular. I spent time in yeshivas. I was a teacher of texts, first in day schools. When I went back to graduate school, I was continuing to think about the teaching of text, and particularly thinking about it in the context of the text and the relationship to history. And I spent many years of my scholarly career thinking and writing about the teaching of text. And I refer in the chapter, I refer to my very first academic article, which I published 25 years ago. Um, that was all about the teaching of text. But the thing about that article was that I wasn't making an argument for why texts are important. I just assumed that texts were important. Of course, the teaching of text is important. Of course, that's at the heart of Jewish education. So I was a text guy, and in many ways, I still am a text guy. I still love to teach the text of the tradition, whether that's in my Brandeis classroom or in other settings. It's still very much a part of who I am, and that hasn't changed. But on the other hand, yeah, my perspective on the centrality of text study has changed. And that's what the book chapter is about. So this wasn't an experience of getting hit by lightning, like it wasn't a conversion experience, but I can point to three kind of dimensions.
I thought maybe like you experienced Gaga dance and everything changed
Right,
for
right.
you.
This all came, you know me very well. It was a very embodied kind of thing. I
Yeah,
was I was dancing and I realized no, that was not what
exactly.
happened. Um, But I can point to three kind of aspects of my experience over the last several years that changed things for me. So the first, I would say, is my pedagogic experience, which is that some students don't have background in the teaching of Jewish texts, and they don't seem to resonate with the texts the way that I do and that some other students. It's just not part of their culture. And I might think that there's nothing better. There's nothing more fun than digging into a classical midrash and unpacking it and seeing all the layers to it. They just can't get there. And part of that is a product of their experience, but also I want to take that experience seriously, or I've started to think about that more seriously, that there really are diverse cultures and not all of them relate to Jewish texts in the same way. So that's the first part that has to do with my teaching, my pedagogy. The second thing, I'll give a label of the ethical experience, and that has to do with the way that not all members of our community are set up to succeed at tech study. Some of us are, many of us are, especially those of us who loved school so much that we basically never left, right? So there's nothing better for those of us who love the engagement with words and text and being in academic environments to do this work. And actually when we think about kind of the American Jewish community and the incredible rates of secular education and the way and the kinds of work that so many American Jews do, that is relevant for a lot of people, but not for everybody. Not for everybody. And you and I both know from our study of education in general that there are a lot of people for whom school just doesn't work, right? The ways that we've set up school just do not work. And they're not well designed to support everybody. And that's the case with tech study as well. And then the third experience is, ironically, it's a much more of an intellectual experience, and that comes from just the continued fascination with this history, with the way that tech study has not been constant, has not been always consistent in Jewish culture. And if we are attuned to that history, and if we study that history with fidelity, then we have to kind of recognize that there have been many changes over time. And I just think we have to take those changes seriously rather than being kind of romantic or ahistorical about it.
Great. So I'm tempted to go in the direction of sort of uh, interrogating the historical claims in the article, but I want to first give space to, since we're talking about other ways of learning, other sites of Torah, just talk us through. You name in the article 4 additional sites, and so talk us through, not in the order that they appear in the chapter, but sort of the ones that you were most excited about. Tell us about these other sites of Torah that you propose.
Yeah, so I use the image of look or the metaphor of location to make the argument that Jewish culture takes place in other locations Beyond the Beit Midrash, right? That's from the title, Beyond the Beit Midrash. And so there are three locations that I talk about in particular outside the Beit Midrash that I want to argue are important locations of Jewish culture. And in each case, what I'm doing in the chapter is I'm drawing on a particular piece of scholarship that I've learned from and that I think is really fascinating, interesting scholarship that helps us to appreciate the cultural work that's happening in that other location. So let me tell you briefly about what those other locations are. The first one is the burial home, or more specifically, the Chevra Kadisha, and more specifically than that, the women's Chevra Kadisha. And here I'm using the amazing scholarship of Deborah Kaplan and Elisheva Karlbach. I was using some earlier pieces that they had written, and it's now been published as a book just recently. Um, they document these women's Chevra Kadisha organizations, women's Chevrot, in early modern Europe. The second location that I talk about is the home, and I'm happy to talk more about that because I think in some ways it's really a centerpiece. And there I'm borrowing from the work of our colleague Dina Aronoff. She also just recently published this work as a book or expanded it, some of the earlier articles into a book called Mother's Milk. And one of the fascinating things there is the way she drills down into the home as, again, as a cultural location, a location where norms and values and language are taught and are learned. She even drills down more specifically to the children's bedroom, which is to say the place where kind of the most intimate space where parents interact with children, or prototypically women, mothers interact with children, and the place where mothers sing lullabies to the children. And she identifies lullabies as this place of kind of cultural work of teaching and learning that happens. The third location is what I call the salon, which is a space in middle class homes. And here I'm particularly drawing on the work of the great musicologist Edwin Seroussi, who studies North African Jewish women, and he documents the way that they used their salons as places for the documentation and the perpetuation of song, of Sephardi Mizrahi song. So there are these three different locations where Jewish culture happens, and I'm making the argument that all of these locations of Jewish culture, they're all beyond the Beit Midrash. They're spaces where Jewish life happens. But when I say Jewish life, that also includes the things that we associate with education. Namely, there are places where people have real knowledge and expertise. There are places where people have received knowledge and expertise from others. We call them teachers. And there are places where people transmit knowledge and expertise to other people. We call them students. So when I'm saying that they're places for Jewish culture, I'm also saying that they are locations for Jewish education if we're willing to think about education broadly.
Great. And you mentioned a lot of women,
Yeah.
a lot of female scholars, um, Dina's wonderful book. So tell me about like reflect more on the gender angle of this work.
Yeah. So the gender analysis, I would say, is central to this argument. I presented an earlier, much briefer version at a conference that we created here at the Mandel Center for Studies in Jewish Education, together with our colleagues at the Hadassah Brandeis Institute, all about gender and Jewish education. And I've clearly learned from a lot of colleagues who do um, kind of gender, I would say gender scholarship or gender studies informed scholarship in Jewish studies. So I start by thinking about the opening up of the Beit Midrash to all kinds of people who did not have access to the Beit Midrash before. The opening up that's happened over the last, let's say, 50 years, starting in sort of the last quarter of the 20th century, opening up the Beit Midrash to people who don't look like me. So I spent a couple of years at Shalavim. That was not open to women. You spent a couple of years at Pardes, so that's an enormously important institution that was created to be a much more open space. I mean, that's when we talk about this really transformative movement in Jewish culture, in the fourth quarter of the 20th century, Pardes is really a huge part of that story, as well as many other institutions like Midrashet Lindenbaum and Nishmat, and later Yeshivat Maharat, and all those in the Orthodox world, but also in the liberal world, liberal seminaries, and then Svara, which is an amazing institution and a phenomenon, and then also academic Jewish studies spaces. And any serious observer of the Jewish community recognizes how profoundly important all these developments have been. There's no question about that. And at the same time, that that opening up of the Beit Midrash includes a kind of implicit, not necessarily explicit, but implicit devaluing of other domains, because the Beit Midrash is where the action is, right? It's not the home or other locations. The Beit Midrash is where real Jewish learning happens. And we believe in the power of the Beit Midrash so much that we're going to make it our mission to open up the Beit Midrash to other people. But that's just not a full picture of Jewish culture, and I think we have to be honest about that. Within feminist scholarship, there's a familiar idea that sometimes the movement to um, welcome women is conditional on women becoming like men. So women are welcomed into a male domain on the condition that they become like men. So I think that's a little bit of an exaggeration to say that we've asked women as a condition of entering the Beit Midrash to become like men. I think that's an exaggeration, and there's a little bit of a kernel of truth to it. So just circling back to the scholarship of our colleague Dina Aronoff, which is really amazing, and I encourage everyone to see. Again, the book is Mother's Milk. She's bringing attention to the home, the domestic space as a location of Jewish culture. And all of the things that happen in the home, the learning of a first language and the lullabies, I mentioned that before, all the home-based practices, all of the spiritual commitments and the norms that we try, not necessarily successfully, but we try to inculcate, especially with small children. There's a kind of she uses the term erasure that tends to happen when we only focus on the texts and the scholarship and the Beit Midrash. And when we say things like, and this happens all the time in among historians, we say things like the education of children begins when children are brought to the school at the age of whatever, 5 or 6 or whatever it happens to be. Wait a second, like what are we imagining is happening? What are we not seeing is happening in the home before the child shows up as if they're a blank slate, which of course they're not a blank slate. They've been acculturated into a whole set of language and norms and practices. And we even say things like they start to say their blessings, but somebody taught them those blessings, right? That happened earlier, and it happened in this other domain. And Dina does just a brilliant job of showing the ways that the home operates as a location of Jewish culture.
So that's fascinating. And I want to push just because
Please.
we're friends and we can. But I wonder if I was going to sort of take a more critical read, is it not what you just said that sort of now that we have opened up the Beit Midrash to women, to queer Jews, to anyone who wants to learn, now it's time to move beyond the Beit Midrash. How do we
Right.
make sure that we don't read your work as saying that, or
Right.
implicitly saying it's not so interesting anymore now that you're all invited?
Right. Right. Good. So there's a potential for a kind of flattening out of all the domains of Jewish culture, and it's all good. And the moment that we provide access to what used to be elite culture, that gets devalued. And, this happens over and over again in the feminization of lots of domains, right? We feminize, I mean, the history of teaching is that teaching became feminized and then it became devalued, right? And those two things happen. So I don't have a magic bullet to solve that problem. I do think that we can take more seriously the work of teaching of Torah, right? This, I hope that my argument is not understood as a devaluation of the teaching of Torah, but I do think it pushes us to think more clearly and critically about the kinds of Torah that we're teaching and the purposes of that Torah. I think we have to be honest about the cultural capital that we do or do not help our students to achieve. And different kinds of knowledge have different kinds of weight. That's a reality. So I think we have to be kind of alert to that. Um, and at the same time to recognize and appreciate the diversity of Jewish culture and the diversity of spaces where Jewish culture happens.
And so I want you to sort of, while we have you live, bring us inside the particular story that you bring from Masachet Brachot that sort of illustrates the ways in which you're not making a new claim. This is not now that we've opened up, I want to shift our focus. But this has actually always been there and just uh, sort of ignored or at least lowered in our priorities of what you called cultural capital in Jewish life.
So asking about the story that I bring at the end of the article about Kahana from Masachet Brachot.
I am, yeah,
Okay,
because I was surprised that Professor Jon Levisohn wrote through that story, and I want to I want you to bring us inside that choice and what that story meant to you.
great, great, and you're totally correct that there's an irony. I hope people will smile at the irony that the move I make sort of toward the end of the article is a move to refer to and implicitly to gain authority from a classical Jewish text. Um, but it's a great story, and I hope that my readers, my listeners, can appreciate it like I do. So let me briefly tell the story, because obviously it may not be familiar to everybody. And this is a story in the Talmud about a student of Kahana, and his teacher is who's just known as Rav. And the story goes that Kahana sneaks into the home of the teacher, and he sneaks into his bedroom, and he hides under his bed. And Kahana comes home at night, and he and his wife start to get romantic. And then Kahana pops up from underneath the bed, and he confronts his teacher. And the text makes it seem like Kahana is kind of amazed that his teacher is a normal human being, is as a normal human relationship with his wife, because Kahana had kind of put Rav on this pedestal. He treated him as, a spiritual master. And why is he just acting like a normal human being? And so the story continues, and not surprisingly, Rav, the teacher, is not happy with Kahana, not happy that his privacy has just been violated. So he kicks him out. But before Kahana leaves, he gets in the last word and he says, Torahi v'lemodani tzarich. This is Torah. This too is Torah, and learn it I must. That's a good poetic way of rendering it. This is also Torah, and I need to learn this as well. And the way that I read this story, the Talmud is not recommending to students that they hide under teachers' beds. That's not the point of the story. It's clear that Kahana is doing something that is obviously wrong, but he does get the last word in the story because actually he's got a good point because there are a lot of things that students need to learn that you can't just learn inside the four walls of the Beit Midrash. You can't learn them from books. And even things that we actually want to learn from our teachers that we need to learn in other kinds of ways. And the text is saying this is also Torah, and it's actually part of a kind of a genre, a mini genre of stories about other things that are also Torah. Torah is not, in this conception, Torah is not just the text, it's not just the Chumash, it's not just the Tanakh, it's not just the Talmud. It includes, it's a kind of tautology. Torah is everything that you need to know or to learn in order to live a good life. And I love the way that this our tradition, our textual tradition, incorporates what I interpret to be a kind of self-critique um, of their own lives and their own norms and their own values, because the rabbis who are engaged in this work, they are the masters of the Beit Midrash. They're the masters of that domain. And they know, they're saying in a text like this one, they're saying, we know that there's a big wide world beyond the Beit Midrash, that the Torah can't be contained within the Beit Midrash, within these four walls of the Beit Midrash. So the educational implication, to my mind, the educational implication is that we have to think more broadly. If we're paying attention to a story like this, we have to think more broadly about how do we take responsibility for helping our students to live good and healthy lives in the fullest sense, right? Even in the sense of their intimate lives. We can't just say like, well, they'll figure it out on their own. How are we making sure that whether it's through direct instruction or through the culture that we build, that they're actually learning the things that they need to learn? We can't just rely on teaching the texts.
Great. And I think this is sort of the last thing we need to address that we've been getting questions on, um, which I'll frame quickly. But sort of what is the implication of what you're saying for institutions of Jewish education, be it day schools, camps, Hebrew schools, communities, and specifically, in the work around sociocultural literacy and home literacies, it got to the point where the script had flipped, which I know you're not trying to do here, right? So all of a sudden, home literacies were beautiful, and school literacies were authoritative and oppressive. And then you literally can see the scholars go, "Oh, wait, but." We still all want the kids to go to school for, 7 to 9 hours a day because that's how our society is structured. So what should they do while they're there? And I want to sort of turn that question as the final question as far as language, as far as curriculum, as far as focus. Imagine that the kids still go to school. What would a Jewish educator, Jewish teacher, admin take from your piece?
Yeah. Right. So I'm not arguing that we should get rid of all of our schools. I'm not arguing that we should get rid of all of our Batei Midrash. And there's really a lot more to be said about this. And many of the things that should be said about this should not be said by me, but should be said by the people who are actually doing this kind of work every day. Because one of the ways to read this argument is to say, like, look, I'm making a conceptual argument and a philosophical argument that's informed by history, that's informed by our understanding that when we study the history, we recognize what I call the historical contingency of the Beit Midrash as we know it today. And that shakes us up a little bit. It makes us recognize that we are actually responsible. We need to be responsible for making choices about um, the what we value within education, including tech study. So this isn't, I would say this isn't an argument against tech study. It's an argument for recognizing everything that surrounds tech study and that supports tech study. I'm not necessarily saying we should replace tech study with lullabies or with cooking classes, but I do think we have to do a better job of thinking through the purposes of tech study and how it fits in with the larger picture of Jewish life. You know, when I'm on the other side of the desk, I sometimes frame this as why should Jewish educators care about this work? I think Jewish educators should care because the questions that I'm exploring here are actually questions that they deal with every day. They know Jewish educators know that the work of Jewish education is much bigger and broader than just trying to stuff as many texts into the heads of students or just trying to get them to understand, biblical Hebrew grammar. They know that it's much bigger and broader than that. They know that that doing the work of Jewish education is always it always involves kind of thinking through Jewish culture and what's valuable about that culture and and what they want to focus on and what they want to emphasize and what they want to cultivate in their students. So at the very least, I hope that this argument is a reminder that Torah is not a static body of knowledge. It's Torah is a practice or a set of practices that live alongside other Jewish practices that interacts with other Jewish practice. So even when we're teaching Torah, I would argue that we are when we're engaged in the work of teaching Torah, I would argue that we need to think about what it means to bring students into a particular cultural domain that lives within and interacts with Jewish culture more broadly.
Great. And I can't help, since we had this question, I know we're out of time, but just quickly on one foot, is this an argument for all American Jews, for all Jews, for Orthodox Jews? Who are you talking to?
I firmly believe that this is relevant to all Jews. I actually think there are ways that this is relevant to culture more generally, but certainly I think that this is relevant to all Jews. I think that there's a fascinating story to be told about the ways that texts and textuality have emerged in liberal Jewish culture in new ways, again, starting about the fourth quarter of the 20th century. And in many ways, that's a wonderful thing. And I also think that it deserves kind of careful consideration. What really are our goals when we're teaching the text of the tradition? As wonderful and enriching and enlivening as that work often is.
Fabulous. John, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today about this exciting new work. Thank you everyone for who's here live and for those of you who will listen when we get it up. I just want to mention that we have another spotlight. We have a spotlight session on Israel education coming up that we hope you all will join us on March 2nd vis-a-vis Zoom. And this is going to be with Alex Thompson and Sivan Zakai and moderated by Jonathan Krasner. And we hope that you will join us. And we are so grateful that you joined us today. And if you enjoyed it, please check out our website to see our upcoming events. Thank you so much. Thank you, John, and for all of those who joined us and submitted questions. Thank you for participating in this conversation.
Thanks, Eva.